They gave her until sundown. That was all the mercy they offered. Not a kind word, not a dollar, not even the decency to look her in the eye when they said it. Just sundown. As if the fading light itself would erase what they were doing to her. We want to tell you about Rosalind Hews. Not because her story ended well, though it did, but because of how it began. Because beginnings like hers happen more often than anyone cares to admit, and the people they happen to don't always survive them. Rosalind was 22 years old the morning her uncle Clement Vore folded his hands on the kitchen table and told her that the farm had been signed over. All of it. The house, the land, the barn, the well. Gone, in a single transaction she hadn't known was coming. Her father had been dead 6 months. The grief was still raw, and Clement, who had managed the estate temporarily while she recovered, had managed it straight into his own name. She stood in that kitchen. The kitchen where her mother had taught her to braid dough, where her father had read the almanac aloud on winter evenings, and she understood with horrible clarity that none of it belonged to her anymore. "You have until sundown," Clement Vore said. He didn't look up from his hands. She took 3 things, the clothes on her back, a canvas sack with 2 days of food, and the awl. The awl had belonged to Nathaniel Stroud. If you've never heard that name, that's all right. Most people hadn't. Nathaniel Stroud was a cobbler who had worked out of a one-room shop on the edge of Garrett Falls, a small town in western Pennsylvania that most maps didn't bother to include. He was 63 when Rosalind's father first brought her there, 7 years old, curious about everything, trailing her father's boots on the wooden floor. Nathaniel had looked down at her with those calm gray eyes and said, "You want to learn something useful, or do you want to watch?" She chose to learn. For the next 11 years, whenever the farm work slowed in winter, whenever the roads were passable and her father could spare her, Rosalind walked the 4 miles to Nathaniel's shop and sat at his bench. He taught her to read leather the way other people read faces, the grain, the give, the places it wanted to split. He taught her to cut with the blade angled just so, to pull a stitch tight without breaking the thread, to punch holes with the awl in a line so straight it looked ruled. He taught her that a well-made shoe was a form of trust. The person wearing it trusted you with every step they took. Nathaniel had no children, no wife. He'd outlived them both. When he died 2 winters before her father, he left the shop to a nephew who immediately sold it. But he left the awl to Rosalind. It was a beautiful thing. Octagonal handle of dark walnut, brass collar worn smooth, blade resharpened so many times it was half its original length. She had wept when the lawyer handed it to her. Now she walked out of her father's house with it tucked inside the sack, and she did not look back. We won't pretend she wasn't afraid. She was. The kind of fear that lives in the stomach and doesn't speak, that just sits there, heavy and cold, as the miles accumulate under your feet. She had $4.30, money she'd saved from selling eggs at market, money Clement hadn't known about. She had the clothes on her back, already dusty by the time she reached the road. And she had skills that lived in her hands, if only she could find somewhere to use them. The town of Haller's Creek was 11 miles east. She'd been there twice in her life, both times with her father to sell grain. She knew there was a market street. She knew there were people. That was enough. She walked through the afternoon and into the early evening, stopping once to drink from a creek and eat the smaller of the 2 biscuits she'd packed. The awl was at the bottom of the sack, but she kept touching it through the canvas, the way you touch a sore tooth, not because it helps, but because it's there. She arrived in Haller's Creek after dark. The market street was closed. A dog barked at her from behind a fence. She slept under the overhang of a hardware store, sitting up, her sack in her lap, and in the morning she began to ask. This is the part of the story that most people don't show you, the asking. The way it feels to walk into a shop and say, plainly, that you need work. The way some people look at you when you say it. The hardware man shook his head before she finished her sentence. The woman at the dry goods store said she had a girl already. The innkeeper looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl, and she left before he finished speaking. It was the 4th stop, a harness shop near the edge of town, where something shifted. The man there, Alden Quore, was a harness maker in his 60s, with hands like knotted rope and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked at her when she came in and said, without particular warmth, "What do you want?" She showed him the awl. She didn't explain it at length. She set it on his counter, said she'd trained under Nathaniel Stroud of Garrett Falls for 11 years, and asked if he had any piecing work he needed done. Alden Quore picked up the awl, turned it over, looked at the brass collar, the handle, the blade. He set it back down. He said, Stroud passed 2, 3 winters ago?" 3, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I've got a pile of trace straps need stitching. Rate's 8 cents a strap. Works clean or you don't get paid." It was not a kindness, it was a transaction. But she took it. She rented a corner of the tack room behind Alden's shop for 30 cents a week, a wooden cot, a single window, a hook on the wall. She worked the straps in the evenings after the shop closed, using the bench light Alden permitted her. And by the end of the first week she had stitched 41 straps, and her work was clean. He didn't say much, but he kept giving her more. She had been in Haller's Creek for 3 weeks when she heard about the Fenwick property. It came up the way things do in small towns. Sideways, in the middle of a conversation about something else. 2 men talking near the water trough while she was passing with a bundle of leather. One said to the other, "And the Fenwick place is sitting empty again, been 2 years now." And the other said something about nobody wanting to pay the back taxes on a dead man's mess. And the first one laughed and they moved on. She stopped walking. She stood there for a moment. A dead man's mess. The county land office was a single room on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, run by a clerk named Harlan Bliss, who seemed mildly startled to see anyone at all. He confirmed, in the bored way of a man who'd said the same thing many times and expected nothing to come of it, that the Fenwick property, 32 acres up on the ridge above Candler Road, with a standing structure, had accrued 2 years of unpaid taxes and was available for settlement. The total owed was $4.80. She had $4.30. She asked if there was any flexibility. Harlan Bliss said no. He said it like a man who had forgotten that words affected people. She went back to Alden's shop and she stitched. She stitched that evening, and the next morning before the shop opened, and during the noon break when other people were eating. She stitched until her fingers were cramped, and her eyes ached in the lamplight. 3 days later she went back to Harlan Bliss with $4.85, exact, and she set it on his counter. He looked at it. He looked at her. He wrote out the deed. "We want you to hold that image for a moment." A young woman, 22 years old, who had been handed nothing, less than nothing, standing in a county clerk's office in a town she'd barely known existed, buying a piece of land with money she'd earned stitching harness straps in a borrowed corner. $4.85, less than most people spent at the tavern in a week. She owned property. Now, she had to see what she'd bought. The Fenwick place was a mile and a half up a rutted track off Candler Road. She walked it on a Sunday morning, the awl tucked in her apron pocket out of habit, the air sharp with October cold. The land was overgrown, goldenrod and sumac taking back the fields, old fence posts leaning at odd angles like tired men. But the soil where she kicked through the weeds to look was dark, good. She noted that. The structure was a one-room cabin built from hand-cut timber, with a stone chimney that had partially separated from the wall. The roof sagged on one side but hadn't given way. The door hung open on a single hinge, and inside, she found what the county clerk's phrase, "a dead man's mess," actually meant. Owen Fenwick had been a cobbler. She stood in the doorway and could not move for a long moment. There was a bench along the far wall, old, scarred, built heavy and low the way cobblers' benches were built. On hooks above it, lasted forms in 3 sizes, a wooden last stand, a heel iron. On the bench itself, dusty and mouse-gnawed at the leather edges, a stitching horse, a draw knife, awls, 4 of them, various gauges, and along the back wall, stacked in rough wooden crates, enough leather scraps and partial hides to supply a shop for a year. Her hands were shaking when she stepped inside. She didn't know Owen Fenwick. She'd never heard his name before that conversation at the water trough. He had died, apparently, without family. That much was clear from the unpaid taxes, from the undisturbed state of the cabin, from the leather still on the bench as if he'd just stepped out and simply never come back. But standing in his shop, surrounded by the tools of the same trade Nathaniel Stroud had put into her hands, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not rescue, not luck, recognition. She went back to town that afternoon and told Alden Quarsh she'd be leaving the tack room. He wasn't surprised. He said, in his flat way, "Fenwick's place." She looked at him. "Word gets around," he said. He picked up a piece of harness he was working on. Then, after a moment, without looking up, "Fenwick was a decent cobbler. Learned from somebody good, I think. But he drank, toward the end. Let everything go." He pulled a stitch tight. "The bench is sound, though. He built it himself." She thanked him. He nodded once and went back to his work. That was, she would come to understand, his version of a long farewell. She moved what little she had to the Fenwick cabin over the course of 2 trips. On the second trip, she brought a borrowed hammer and nails, and she fixed the door hinge before nightfall. She slept that night on a pile of grain sacks she'd bought from the feed store, in a cabin that belonged to her, with the awl on the floor beside her head. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind in the pines. The chimney needed reseating before she could risk a fire. The roof would need attention before the heavy snows. She had approximately nothing. No furniture, no cook stove, no lamp oil past what she'd carried in a small jar. She had the tools on Owen Fenwick's bench, and the leather in his crates, and 32 acres of overgrown land, and the skills Nathaniel Stroud had spent 11 years putting into her hands. She thought, this is enough. It has to be enough. It was. The first customers came the way first customers always come, one at a time, reluctantly, wanting to be sure you were real before they committed. A farmer's wife whose boot sole had separated. She'd heard there was a cobbler up on Candler Road. A boy who needed a harness buckle replaced. A man with a dress boot that had split at the welt who looked skeptically at her age before she showed him the repair, and who came back a month later with his Sunday boots. She built slowly. She kept her prices fair, slightly below what a cobbler in town would charge, because she needed the work more than she needed the margin. She worked by a lantern she'd traded 2 repaired pairs of boots to get. She expanded Owen Fenwick's tool collection piece by piece, adding what she needed, maintaining what was already there with a care that she thought of, privately, as respect for the man who'd left it. There was a crate she hadn't opened at first, shoved under the bench, heavier than the others. She'd assumed it was more leather scraps. It was, partly. But when she finally dragged it out in November, working on the cabin by afternoon light, she found that underneath 2 layers of scrap leather, there was a stack of composition books. 12 of them. The handwriting inside was cramped and careful. Owen Fenwick had kept records. Not a journal exactly, more like notes, accounts of work, materials costs, customer names, hours spent on different types of repairs. But woven through the practicalities were observations she hadn't expected. Notes on local suppliers, and which ones could be trusted, and which ones short-weighted their leather. Notes on the soil on the ridge. He'd tried a kitchen garden and recorded what grew, and what didn't, which corner got the most sun, where the water pooled after rain. Notes on the town, on people's characters, on who paid promptly and who made excuses. One entry stopped her cold. I have a standing arrangement with Mercer Tull at the mill. He lets me buy seconds leather at half price because I keep his cart horses in shoes at no charge. This seems disadvantageous until you account for the quality of Mercer's seconds, which are better than most tanners' firsts. Any cobbler in this county who pays full price for leather from Haddam's is a fool or doesn't know the alternative. She stared at that for a while. She went to the mill the following week and introduced herself to Mercer Tull, a wide man with flour in his beard who looked at her narrowly when she mentioned Owen Fenwick's name. You bought his place, Mercer said. It wasn't quite a question. I did, she said. He left some notebooks. He wrote well of you. Mercer Tull was quiet for a moment. He was a decent man, he said, in the tone people use when they mean to say more than that. Went sideways at the end, but decent. He looked at her. You do horses. She had shod exactly 1 horse in her life, a plow horse belonging to a neighbor back home, and she'd done it badly. She had not mentioned this to anyone. I'm learning, she said honestly. Mercer Tull scratched his chin. Learning's fine, he said. I'll give you the same rate I gave him. You keep my 4 cart horses and good shoes, you buy your leather at half Haddam's price. We settle accounts at the end of each season. She shook his hand. She spent the next month teaching herself to shoe horses properly, using a library book she'd borrowed from the pastor's wife and an old draft mare belonging to a neighbor who let her practice in exchange for free boot repairs. By the time Mercer's horses needed their winter shoes, she was ready. This is what Owen Fenwick gave her. Not the tools, though the tools mattered. Not the leather, though the leather mattered. Too, he gave her the knowledge of how this particular place worked, its systems, its relationships, its hidden economies. He had spent years learning the landscape of Hauler's Creek, and he had written it all down, not for anyone in particular, and not knowing that the person who most needed it would be a 22-year-old woman who would arrive 7 years after he was gone and pull the notebooks out from under a bench. Winter came. She put the chimney right with the help of a neighbor, a retired farmhand named Gus Kettner, who took payment in boot repairs and didn't ask unnecessary questions. She cut firewood. She insulated the roof with a layer of hay and old canvas under the shingles, imperfect but sufficient. She was not comfortable that winter, not warm enough, not well fed enough, not free from worry. But she was there. She was working. She was surviving. And then Clement Vore found her. We had been wondering when he would appear, and perhaps you had too. He came in February on a gray morning. When she was working at the bench, the door shut against the cold. She heard the horse before she heard the knock. Heavy hoofbeats on the frozen ground. 2 horses stopping outside. Then knocking. Then the door opening without her invitation to open it. Because that was the kind of man Clement Vore had always been. He stood in the doorway with a man she didn't know behind him, and he looked at the cabin and the bench and her, and he said, "I heard you'd set up out here." She set down the boot she was working on. She didn't stand. "I have," she said. Clement was 60, gray-haired, well-fed in a way that suggested he'd always had enough and then some. The man behind him was younger, with the look of someone accustomed to carrying documents and doing what he was told. Clement stepped inside without being asked. The younger man stayed near the door. "You left some things behind," Clement said. "When you left in such a hurry." She had left nothing behind. He had taken everything. "What things?" she asked. "Your mother's ring," he said. "Some linens. A bit of furniture that was, strictly speaking, part of the estate." He said it pleasantly, the way a cat is pleasant with a mouse. "I've had my man draw up a list. There are items there that technically belong to the property, which is to say, to me. If you've taken them with you, there's a question of—" "I took nothing," she said. "Nonetheless," he said, "I have an inventory, and there are items unaccounted for." "Show me the inventory," she said. He paused. He hadn't expected that. She held out her hand. The younger man at the door looked at Clement. Clement looked at her. He had spent 6 months assuming she was manageable, grieving, young, without resources, without allies. He had not recalculated. "Harlan Bliss at the county office keeps good records," she said. "I've come to know him fairly well. The deed to this property is clean and recorded. My name is on it. If you have a legal claim on items I've allegedly removed from your estate, you'll need to present it in writing, with specifics, to the county judge." She picked up the boot she'd been working on. "The judge, I'm told, holds court on Thursdays. I'll be here all week." Something shifted in Clement Vore's expression. Not guilt. Men like him didn't do guilt. But recalculation. The recognition that she was not the person she had been on the morning he'd told her she had until sundown. "You've gotten bold," he said. "I've gotten settled," she said. "There's a difference." He left. The younger man followed, closing the door with exaggerated quietness, as if that constituted a kind of dignity. She listened to the hoofbeats recede across the frozen ground, and she sat very still for a moment after they faded. Then she picked up her awl and went back to work. The spring thaw came. She plowed a section of the garden corner that Owen Fenwick had identified as the best sun exposure, following his notes almost to the letter. She planted late but well. She took on a second regular customer from 2 towns over, a woman who needed orthopedic work done on boots for a foot that had healed crooked after a break. Delicate, precise work that Rosalind had never done before, and that she taught herself slowly, carefully, over 2 months. The woman wept when she first walked properly in the finished boots. Rosalind did not mention that she'd remade them twice before getting them right. She hired Gus Kettner's granddaughter, a 14-year-old named Fern, who had quick hands and a good eye, and was glad of pocket money. Fern did the simpler repairs and learned, the way Rosalind had learned from Nathaniel Stroud, by watching and asking and being allowed to try. Rosalind paid her fairly. She remembered what it felt like to be paid fairly when everything else was uncertain. By summer, she had a waiting list. In the fall, a year and a half after she'd walked out of her father's house with $4.30 and an awl in a canvas sack, she sent a letter to the county assessor requesting a formal property survey. The survey confirmed what Owen Fenwick's notebooks had suggested. There was a spring on the northwest corner of the property, previously unmarked, that had legal implications for the property line. She filed the paperwork. The boundary adjustment added 4 acres to her deed. She was standing outside her cabin, reading the assessor's response, when Fern came out with 2 cups of coffee and asked what the letter said. Rosalind folded it and put it in her apron pocket, next to the awl. "It says the land is ours," she said. "All of it." She thought of Owen Fenwick, who had bought this land and built this bench and written those notebooks and died without anyone to pass them to. She thought of Nathaniel Stroud, who had put the awl in her hand and taught her that a well-made shoe was a promise. She thought of her father, who had brought her to that shop when she was 7 years old because he'd wanted her to learn something useful. She thought of Clement Vore telling her she had until sundown. He had meant it as an ending. She had treated it as a beginning. She had not been saved. She had not been lucky, exactly. Luck is the wrong word for what happens when skill meets an opportunity you have the strength to recognize. She had simply refused to put down what was in her hands. The tools were still on the bench. The notebooks were on the shelf, worn now at the edges from being read and reread, annotated in her own hand in the margins. The awl was in her pocket, where it had been since the morning she'd left home, where it would stay. And in the spring, she would hire a proper farmhand and start bringing the back fields under cultivation. The ones Owen Fenwick had noted had good drainage, the ones she'd been looking at for a year and a half, with a feeling she recognized now as anticipation. There was still a great deal of work to do. She had never been more grateful for that in her life. "We'll leave you here." With Rosalind Hews on the ridge above Candler Road, a cup of cooling coffee in her hand, 36 acres of Pennsylvania land in her name, and an awl in her apron pocket that had passed through 3 pairs of hands before hers and still had years of use left in it. "Before we go, we want to ask you something." Rosalind didn't wait for someone to give her permission to begin again. She used what she already had, skills most people would have overlooked, tools most people would have left behind. "We wonder, is there something in your hands right now that you've underestimated? Something you learned from someone who's gone, some small skill you haven't fully used yet? We think about that sometimes. We think you might too.